His extraordinary spirit never burned more brightly than in these last, gloomy days. The money to pay the troops was exhausted. He issued notes, signing them with his own name. The citizens groaned under the triple scourge of scarcity, disease, and war. He ordered the bands to play merrily and discharged rockets. It was said that they were abandoned, that help would never come, that the expedition was a myth, the lie of a general who was disavowed by his government. Forthwith he placarded the walls with the news of victories, and of the advance of a triumphant British army, or hired all the best houses by the river's bank for the accommodation of the officers of the relieving force. A dervish shell crashed through his palace. He ordered the date of its arrival to be inscribed above the whole. For those who served him faithfully he struck medals, and presented them with pomp and circumstance. Others less laudable he shot. And by all these means and expedients the defense of the city was prolonged through the summer, autumn, and winter of 1884. And on into the year 1885. All this time the public anxiety in England had been steadily growing. If Gordon was abandoned, he was by no means forgotten. As his mission had been followed with intense interest throughout the whole country, so its failure had caused general despondency. Disappointment soon gave place to alarm. The subject of the personal safety of the distinguished envoy was first raised in the House of Commons on the 16th of March by Lord Randolph Churchill. Availing himself of the opportunities provided by supply, he criticized the vacillating policy of the government, their purposeless slaughter in the eastern Sudan, and their failure to establish the Suakin-Berber route. He proceeded to draw attention to the perilous position of General Gordon at Khartoum. Colonel Coetlogon has stated that Khartoum may be easily captured. We know that General Gordon is surrounded by hostile tribes and cut off from communications with Cairo and London, and under these circumstances the House has a right to ask Her Majesty's government whether they are going to do anything to relieve him. Are they going to remain indifferent to the fate of the one man on whom they have counted to extricate them from their dilemmas, to leave him to shift for himself, and not make a single effort on his behalf? Hansard's Parliamentary Debates, March 16, 1884. The government remained impassive. Lord E. Fitzmaurice made some sort of reply, and there were ministerial cheers. But the subject, once raised, was not allowed to drop. Inspired and animated by the earnest energy of a young man, the opposition were continually growing stronger. The conduct of Egyptian affairs afforded ample opportunity for criticism and attack. All through the summer months and almost every night ministers were invited to declare whether they would rescue their envoy, or leave him to his fate. Mr. Gladstone returned evasive answers. The Conservative press took the cue. The agitation became intense. Even among the supporters of the government there was dissatisfaction. But the Prime Minister was obdurate and unflinching. At length, at the end of the session, the whole matter was brought forward in the gravest and most formal way by the moving of a vote of censure. The debate that followed Sir Michael Hicks Beecher's motion was long and acrimonious. Mr. Gladstone's speech only increased the disquietude of his followers and the fury of the opposition. Mr. Foster openly declared his disagreement with his leader, and although Lord Hartington in winding up the debate threw out some hopes of an expedition in the autumn, the government majority fell on the division to 28. And after the prorogation the controversy was carried on with undiminished vigour outside the walls of Parliament, and the clamour in the country grew louder and louder. It is usual to look upon Mr. Gladstone's conduct in the matter of the relief of Gordon as dictated by benevolent weakness. History may take another view. Strong and stubborn as was the character of the general, that of the minister was its equal. If Gordon was the better man, Gladstone was incomparably the greater. It was easy for the First Minister of the Crown to despatch an expedition against savages. He was accustomed to the exercise of power. Compared with the resources of the empire, the enterprise was insignificant. Few men have feared responsibility less than Gladstone. On the other hand, the expressed desire of the nation was a force to which he had always bowed, to which, indeed, he owed his political existence. Yet, in spite of the growing agitation throughout the land, he remained stern and silent. Most men do what is right, or what they persuade themselves is right, nor is it difficult to believe that Mr. Gladstone did not feel justified in involving the nation in operations in the heart of the Sudan for the purpose, not of saving the life of the envoy, for Gordon had but to embark on his steamers and come home, but simply in order to vindicate the personal honor of a man. And it is possible that a feeling of resentment against the officer, whose intractable nature was bringing such odium upon the government, may have colored his resolution with a darker tinge. But for all his power and influence he was forced to give way. The government, which had long ignored the call of honor abroad, was driven to the Sudan by the cries of shame at home. Lord Hartington, at that time Secretary of State for War, must be dissociated from the general censure which his principal colleagues have incurred. He was the first to recognize the obligation which lay upon the cabinet, and through the cabinet upon the nation, and it was to his influence that the despatch of the relieving expedition was mainly due. The Commander-in-Chief and the Adjutant-General, who were fully alive to the critical position at Khartoum, added their recommendations. But even at the last moment Mr. Gladstone was induced to sanction the advance only by the belief that the scale of the operations would be small, and that only a single brigade would be necessary. The decision was taken forthwith by the ministry and announced to the nation. The Adjutant-General, however, asked for a very different force from what the government had anticipated, and the single brigade was expanded into an expedition of 10,000 men, selected from the whole army. To reverse the decision was now, however, impossible, and the Gordon Relief Expedition began. The commander to whom the conduct of the operations had been entrusted reviewed the situation. He saw himself confronted with a task which was easy and safe if it were undertaken at leisure, and which was doubtful and perilous if begun in haste. All the fruits of a long and successful career were staked on the result, and it is scarcely wonderful that he declined to be swift and reckless. Shrewdly estimating the military difficulties, he made his plans for a methodical and deliberate advance, which would leave nothing to luck, and which resembles in character that afterwards carried out by Sir H. Kitchener. He excluded the idea of a wild glorious rush, which might result in astonishing success, or terrible disaster. Troops and stores were steadily collected at Wadi Halfa and along the Nile. The new Camel Corps, consisting of 4 regiments, practiced their drills and evolutions. To pilot the boats up the cataracts, voyagers were brought from Canada. At length, when all preparations were complete, the expedition started. The plan was simple. A strong column of infantry in boats was to work up the river. In case that should not arrive in time, the Camel Corps was to strike across the Bayuda Desert from Korti to Metema. Having arrived there, a small detachment was to be thrown into Khartoum by Gordon's steamers to sustain the defense until the arrival of the main body in March, or even April of 1885, when the town could be regularly relieved. The dramatic character of the enterprise and its picturesque and original features fascinated the nation, and the advance was watched with breathless interest. The fortunes of the river column have been graphically described by one who played no small part in their attempt. The Campaign of the Cataracts, by Sir William Butler, is a record of hard and unceasing toil. Day after day the long lines of soldiers hauled on the tow ropes, or pulled at the oars of the broad-bottomed boats. Night after night, they camped on the banks amid the grim desolation of the Monastir Desert. Yet their monotonous labors were encouraged by the knowledge that as soon as the bend of the river at Abu Hamd was reached, the strong north wind would carry them swiftly to Khartoum. And it seemed a strange and bitter irony that the order to turn back and the news that all had been in vain was announced to the troops on the very day when they had cleared the cataracts and were moving forward at 5 times their former speed. The Desert Column started from Corti on the 30th of December. Their strength did not exceed 1,100 officers and men, but they were the flower of the army. Dropping their communications, they set forth along the caravan route towards Metemma. The knowledge which we have since gained of the resources of the Mahdaists enables the peril of their desperate venture to be fully appreciated. Although the dervishes were neither so well armed nor trained as at a later date, they were nearly as numerous and equally devoid of fear. Their tactics were more in accordance with modern conditions. Their fanaticism was at its height. The British force, on the other hand, was equipped with weapons scarcely comparable with those employed in the concluding campaigns. Instead of the powerful Lee Metford rifle, with its smokeless powder, its magazine action, and its absence of recoil, they were armed with the Martini Henry, which possessed none of these advantages. In place of the deadly Maxim, there was the Gardner gun, the very gun that jammed at Tamai, and that jammed again at Abu Klea. The artillery was also in every respect inferior to that now in general use. Besides all this, the principles of fire discipline and of scientific musketry were new, little understood, and hardly admitted. Nevertheless, the Camel Corps went boldly forward, and engaged an enemy whose destruction ultimately required the strength of a better armed and better instructed army 12 times as strong. On the 3rd of January, they reached Gakdal Wells. 100 miles of their march was accomplished. But they were now delayed by the necessity of escorting a second column of supplies to Gakdal, and after that until the arrival of reinforcements, which raised their strength to 1,800 of all ranks. The interval was employed in building 2 small forts and establishing an advance depot, nor was it until the 13th that the march was resumed. The number of camels was not sufficient for the necessities of the transport. The food of the camels was too poor for the work they had to perform. By the 16th, however, they had made 50 miles, and approached the wells of Abu Klea. Here their further advance was disputed by the enemy. The news of the advance of the Desert Column had been duly reported to the Mahdi and his Arab generals. A small party of English, it was said, with camels and some cavalry, were coming swiftly to the rescue of the accursed city. Their numbers were few, scarce 2,000 men. How should they hope to prevail against the expected Mahdi and the conquering Ansar who had destroyed Hicks? They were mad, yet they should die, not one should escape. The delay in the advance offered ample opportunity. A great force of Arabs was concentrated. Slatin relates how several thousand men under important emirs were detached from the army before Khartoum, and marched northward eager for the slaughter of the enemies of God. At Metemma the main strength of the Jalin tribe was collected. With the reinforcements from Omdurman, the total force of the Arabs actually at hand was not less than 10,000, and behind were many thousands more. They permitted the little column to advance until their retreat, if defeated, was impossible, and then, confident of victory, offered battle near the wells of Abu Klea. The Camel Corps remained halted during the morning of the 16th, and built a small fort, in which they placed their reserve of stores, and made some arrangement for the reception of wounded. At 1 o'clock they moved leisurely forward, passed through the rocky defile, which led into the valley of Abu Klea, and bivouacked. Early the next morning the force moved out in square formation, and advanced upon the enemy. The most savage and bloody action ever fought in the Sudan by British troops followed. Notwithstanding the numbers and the valor of the Arabs, that they penetrated the square, and that they inflicted on the troops a loss of 9 officers, and 65 men killed and 9 officers, and 85 men wounded, 10% of the entire force, they were driven from the field with great slaughter, and the Desert Column camped at the wells. On the morning of the 18th they rested, placed their wounded in the small fort they had built, and buried their dead. In the afternoon they continued their advance, marched all through the night, and having covered 23 miles, halted exhausted, almost within sight of the river, at daylight on the 19th. Meanwhile the enemy had again collected in great strength, and an effective rifle fire was opened on the column. Sir Herbert Stewart received the wound of which a few weeks later he died. The command devolved upon Sir Charles Wilson. The position was desperate. Water was running short. The Nile was only 4 miles away, but the column were impeded by their wounded and stores, and between the river and the thirsty men lay the dervish army, infuriated by their losses and fully aware of the sore straits to which their astonishing enemy was now reduced. It now became necessary to divide the small force. Some must remain to guard the baggage and the wounded, the others must fight their way to the water. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon of the 19th, 900 men left the hastily made zeriba and marched towards the river. Without their camels or those of the transport they appeared insignificant, a mere speck on the broad plain of Metemma. The dervishes hastened to clinch the matter. The square advances slowly and painfully over the stony ground, with frequent jerky halts to preserve order and to pick up the wounded. Little puffs of white smoke dot the distant sand hills. Here and there a gaudy flag waves defiantly. In front the green tops of the palm trees by the Nile tantalize, but stimulate the soldiers. On the left the great mud labyrinth of Metemma stretches indefinitely. Suddenly the firing stops. The low scrub in front is alive with the swarming figures of the enemy. All the flags dance forward together. Ragged white figures spring up in hundreds. Emirs on horses appear as if by magic. Everywhere are men running swiftly forward, waving their spears and calling upon the Prophet of God to speed their enterprise. The square halts. The weary men begin to fire with thoughtful care, the dervishes drop thickly. On then, children of the desert. You are so many, they are so few. They are worn with fatigue and their throats are parched. You have drunk deeply of the Nile. One rush will trample the accursed under the feet of the faithful. The charge continues. A bugle sounds in the waiting square. The firing stops. What is this? They lose heart. Their ammunition is exhausted. On, then, and make an end. Again the smoke ripples along the line of bayonets and fire is reopened, this time at closer range, and with far greater effect. The stubborn grandeur of the British soldier is displayed by desperate circumstances. The men shoot to hit. The attack crumples. The emir's horse and man collapse. The others turn and walk, for they will not run sullenly back towards the town. The square starts forward. The road to the river is open. With dusk the water is reached, and never have victors gained a more longed-for prize. The Nile is won. Gordon remains. Sir Charles Wilson, having collected his force, remained 3 days by the bank of the Nile before attempting any further advance on Khartoum. He has explained why this delay was necessary, to the satisfaction of most military critics. Nor is it easy to believe that men, who had made such splendid efforts, would have willingly lost a single moment. On the 4th day he embarked on 2 of Gordon's steamers, which awaited the relieving column, and taking with him 20 British soldiers, and a few bluejackets, set forth towards the Shabluka Gorge, and the town that lay beyond. On the 27th of January the rescuers came in sight of Khartoum, and under the fire of the enemy. Many of their perilous adventures seem to belong to romance rather than to reality, the tiny gimcrack boats struggling with the strong stream of the cataract, running the gauntlet of the Arab guns, dropping disconsolately down the river with their terrible news, or wrecked and stranded on the sandbank. Stuart Wortley. Rowing to the camp before Metemma for help, Beresford starting in the remaining steamer, the bursting of the boiler by a dervish shell, Benbow mending it in a single day, Wilson's rescue, and the return to the entrenchment at Gubat. But the scene that appeals to the imagination above all the others, is that where with both banks ablaze with musketry and artillery, the black smoke pouring through the shot holes in the funnels, the water rising in spurts from the bullets, the men who had come so far and braved so much stared at the palace roof, and, seeing no flag flying, knew that all was over and that they had come too late. The news of the dervish defeats at Abu Klea and Abu Kru impelled the Mahdi to a desperate venture. The English were but 120 miles away. They were few, but victorious. It was difficult to say what force could stop such men. In spite of the wrath of the true God and the valor of Islam, they might prevail. The Mahdi depended on success for existence. The tremendous forces of fanaticism are exerted only in a forward direction. Retreat meant ruin. All must be staked on an immediate assault. And, besides, the moment was ripe. Thus the Arab chiefs reasoned, and wisely resolved to be reckless. Thus the night of the 25th of January arrived. The band played as usual in the evening. Gradually the shadows fell and it became dark. The hungry inhabitants betook themselves to bed. The anxious but indomitable commander knew that the crisis impended, and knew also that he was powerless to avert it. Perhaps he slept, satisfied that he had done his duty, and in the silence of the night the savage enemy crawled stealthily towards the town. The weary and disheartened sentinels, weakened by famine and tired of war, maintained a doubtful vigilance along the ramparts. The subsiding waters of the river had left a bare gap between the White Nile and the wall. Perhaps there was treachery besides. On a sudden the loud explosion of musketry broke the stillness of the night and the slumbers of the people, and with a continual shouting thousands of dervishes swarmed through the unprotected space, and entered Khartoum. One mob of assailants made their way to the palace. Gordon came out to meet them. The whole courtyard was filled with wild, harlequin figures and sharp, glittering blades. He attempted a parley. "Where is your master, the Mahdi?" He knew his influence over native races. Perhaps he hoped to save the lives of some of the inhabitants. Perhaps in that supreme moment imagination flashed another picture before his eyes, and he saw himself confronted with the false prophet of a false religion, confronted with the European prisoners who had denied their Lord, offered the choice of death or the Quran. Saw himself facing that savage circle with a fanaticism equal to, and a courage greater than, their own, marching in all the pride of faith, and with retorted scorn to a martyr's death. It was not to be. Mad with the joy of victory and religious frenzy, they rushed upon him, and, while he disdained even to fire his revolver, stabbed him in many places. The body fell down the steps and lay a twisted heap at the foot. There it was decapitated. The head was carried to the Mahdi. The trunk was stabbed again and again by the infuriated creatures, till nothing but a shapeless bundle of torn flesh and bloody rags remained of what had been a great and famous man, and the envoy of Her Britannic Majesty. The blood soaked into the ground, and left a dark stain, which was not immediately effaced. Slatin mentions that the Arabs used often to visit the place. Allwalder went himself, and more than 6 weeks after the capture of the town, saw black spots upon the steps. But they have all since been obliterated. Such, briefly, is the story of the fall of Khartoum and of the death of Gordon. The fact that the 2 steamers arrived only 2 days after the capture of the town has given color to the belief that, but for the 3 days' delay at Metemmeh, the catastrophe might have been averted. This view appears incorrect. The Arabs had long held Khartoum at their mercy. They hoped, indeed, to compel its surrender by famine and to avoid an assault, which after their experience at El Obeid they knew must cost them dear. Gordon has stated in his journals that the town became defenseless by the middle of December. The arrival of 20 British soldiers and a few officers could not have materially affected the situation, could only, in fact, have increased the loss. Yet nearly everyone who reads the tale will wish in spite of reason that some help, however little, had reached the lonely man, that before the darkness fell he had grasped an English hand and learned that his countrymen had not abandoned him, had not forgotten, would never forget. It may not be possible as yet to fix the exact place which Charles Gordon will occupy in English history. It is certainly a high one. Whether he will rank as a commander with Peterborough, Wolfe, and Olive, those who come after us must decide. We may, however, assert that he was a man of stainless honor and enduring courage, who in varied capacities displayed a fertile and abundant genius. He was careless alike of the honors and comforts of the world, and looked forward with firm faith to the rewards of a future state. The severity of his religion did not impair the amiability of his character. The uncertainty of his moods may have frequently affected the soundness of his opinions, but not often the justice of his actions. Gordon's statue, set up in the indignant grief of the nation in the space which is appropriated to the monuments of great captains by sea and land, claims the attention of the passerby, not only because it is comparatively new. The figure, its pose, and its story are familiar even to the poorest citizens of London, and to people from all parts of the United Kingdom. Serene amid the noise of the traffic, as formerly in that of the battle, the famous general seems still, with bowed head and thoughtful countenance, to revolve the problems of the dark Soudan, and, inattentive to the clamor of men, inquires what is acceptable to God. With the capture of the city and the death of the envoy, the reason for the expedition disappeared. It remained only to withdraw the troops. The stores which had been brought across the desert at a terrible cost were thrown hastily into the Nile. The battered steamers, which had waited so long at Metemma, were hurriedly dismantled. The Camel Corps, their extraordinary efforts futile and their camels killed, marched back on foot to Corti. Their retreat was pressed by the exultant enemy. The river column, whose boats after months of labor had just cleared the cataracts, and who had gained a success at Kirbekan, were carried back swiftly by the strong current against which they had hopefully struggled. The whole expeditionary force, guards, Highlanders, sailors, hussars, Indian soldiers, Canadian voyagers, mules, camels, and artillery trooped back forlornly over the desert sands, and behind them the rising tide of barbarism followed swiftly, until the whole vast region was submerged. For several months the garrison of Kassala under a gallant Egyptian maintained a desperate resistance, but at last famine forced them to surrender, and they shared the fate of the garrisons of El Obeid, Darfur, Sobat, Tokar, Sinkat, Sennar, and Khartoum. The evacuation of the Soudan was thus completed.